Welcome back to Spooky Stories, Unexplained Encounters. Today we'll be covering one of North America's most famous UFO sightings, the Exeter incident, when three men saw something quite unexplained. September 3rd, 1965, 2 a.m. A young man, Norman Muscarello, was walking home from his girlfriend's in a town about 10 miles away from his home in Exeter, New Hampshire. Muscarello would make this trip regularly, typically hitchhiking his way through. But, as it was very late at night, or perhaps early in the morning, there were no cars to wave down. So, Muscarello continued to walk along the road alone. A few miles out of Exeter, in the town of Kensington, Muscarello looked out and saw a welcome sight: lights on the horizon. Finally, after all this time, a car or truck was going to pass by. But, as he drew closer to the lights, he realized something terrifying. The lights were not coming from any sort of vehicle he had ever seen before. There, floating in the field ahead of him, were two large craft with bright red lights. They made absolutely no sound as he watched them float in the field and then over two homes nearby. Heart racing, Muscarello watched as one of the objects turned and suddenly began heading straight for him. Quickly, he ran and jumped down into a nearby ditch, hiding from the object. When he managed to look back out, he watched as the objects began floating off into the forest. With the path now open, the young man ran towards the houses and began knocking and yelling for help. The owners of one of the houses, the Dining family, were reportedly not home. The owners of the other house, the Russells, were home, but were too frightened of Muscarello's cries to open the door. Looking out, Muscarello noticed a car coming down the road. His eyes trained on the car, he sprinted out of the field and to the street, waving down the car. He told the couple he needed to go to the police station. That night, Reginald Toland was working the night desk, as he did most nights. He was in his 50s and was nicknamed Scratch. That night had been a relatively quiet night for the officer, at least so far. Suddenly, the door to the station burst open and a young man who Toland recognized, it was a small town after all, sprinted up to his desk. He was shaking, pale, and clearly very upset by something. The story poured out of Muscarello's mouth, and he begged the officer to have someone check out the area. Unsure of what to make of the report given by Muscarello, who was hysterical, Toland radioed in offered Eugene Bertrand Jr. to come back into the station. Eugene Bertrand Jr. had quite the night. He had been out on the road when he had come across a woman huddled in her car pulled off to the side. She was just off of the Route 101 bypass. Bertrand came up to the car and managed to get the woman to speak with him. She was clearly frightened. She said that she had been chased by red lights in the sky that had followed her from Epping, about 12 miles away. After managing to calm the woman down, Bertrand sent her on her way, confident that she had simply misidentified something. Now, hours later, he was being called back to the station because of another sighting of strange lights in the sky. Tired and confused, Bertrand made his way back to the station. Upon arriving, Bertrand was caught up with the night's events by Muscarello and Toland. While he may have brushed the earlier account off as a misidentification, this time Bertrand did not. 2 accounts in one night was significant. He listened intently and then asked if Muscarello knew how to get back to where he had originally seen the craft. This was the second sighting that day. Perhaps the craft would show itself again. The 2 men got into the officer's cruiser and drove out to Kensington, where Muscarello had encountered the terrifying ships. It was still dark, not yet dawn, and the air was quiet. They walked out into the field, Bertrand shining his light across the grass and nearby trees, looking for anything that may have been out of place. Suddenly, the animals in the nearby barn began to kick around and make noises, clearly disturbed by something going on outside. "There it is! That's it!" Muscarello screamed out, grabbing Bertrand and pointing off towards the forest where, to Bertrand's surprise, a large object came slowly into focus. The craft swayed in the air, coming lazily towards them. The red lights in the craft's body lit up in a hypnotic sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Confronted with this unknown object, Bertrand grabbed his gun and aimed it at the craft, calling back to the station, "My God, I see the damn thing myself." Back at base, Toland gets Bertrand's message and quickly sends another officer, David Hunt, to the location as backup. Back in Kensington, Bertrand is staring up at the craft, his gun fixed. But would shooting at the object make a difference? Or could it provoke it? Slowly, Bertrand holstered his weapon. Numb, the two men continued to watch the object and its slow movements across the early morning sky. Then, as slowly as it had happened, the craft began to drift away, back into the trees, but did not disappear entirely before one other witness saw it, Hunt, who finally arrived on site. He too watched it, dumbfounded. Suddenly, a new noise filled the air that was later identified by Hunt as a B-47 bomber. They stood there until it was once more silent in the field. Eventually, the three men made their way back to the station after a strange and now infamous night. When they got back to their desks, both Hunt and Bertrand wrote up their reports of what they had seen, however unbelievable it may have sounded. After, the officers took Muscarello back home, where his mother was waiting, probably irritated at this point, as it is well past 3 a.m. The reports written by the officers did not sit in a stack of papers, never to be seen by the light of day. In fact, the police chief read them relatively soon and contacted Peace Air Force Base with the message. They had spotted a UFO. Representatives from the Air Force came and interviewed the three witnesses and asked them not to speak with the press. Unfortunately, they had already been contacted and interviewed by a local reporter, so the story was out. Taking the next best step available, the Air Force reached out to Project Blue Book, the official Air Force group assigned to UFO research, and asked that they review the testimony. The Air Force major who had interviewed the men is quoted as saying in his correspondence with Project Blue Book, "At this time, I have been unable to arrive at a probable cause of this sighting. The three observers seem to be stable, reliable persons, especially the two patrolmen. I viewed the area of the sighting and found nothing in the area that could be the probable cause. Peace Air Force Base had 5 B-47 aircraft flying in the area, but I do not believe that they had any connection with this sighting." However, before Project Blue Book could give a response, the Pentagon put forth a statement saying that the three men had only seen stars and planets twinkling, or a temperature inversion, the same explanation they gave for another possible UFO sighting, the invasion of Washington, about 10 years prior. Even after the Pentagon put out their official statement, Project Blue Book still decided to release their own. In it, they said that Operation Big Blast, a training operation, had been taking place that night. During the operation, many different aircraft had been active, and one of them could have been the craft seen by the men. Project Blue Book went on to say that since none of the personnel taking part in the training had seen any sort of UFO, that the craft the group saw was more than likely one being used in the training. Otherwise, those in the air would have been aware and would have reported it. This explanation was not well received by Muscarello, Hunt, and Bertrand. The men wrote back to the Air Force stating, "As you can imagine, we have been the subject of considerable ridicule since the Pentagon released its final evaluation of our sighting on September 3, 1965. In other words, both Patrolman Hunt and myself saw this object at close range, checked it out with each other, confirmed and reconfirmed that it was not any type of conventional aircraft, and went to considerable trouble to confirm that the weather was clear, there was no wind, no chance of weather inversion, and that what we were seeing was in no way a military or civilian aircraft." The men went on to remind the Air Force that this craft made no noise and was not shaped like a typical craft at all. How then could it be one of the planes used in the training? Not only that, but Operation Big Blast would have ended hours beforehand. The men did eventually get a letter back from the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force, wherein it is reported to have said, "Based on additional information submitted to our UFO investigation officer, Wright Patterson, AFB, Ohio, we have been unable to identify the object you observed on September 3, 1965. Which, all things considered, may have been viewed as a small victory for the witnesses." The Exeter UFO incident is one of the most well-documented cases of a UFO encounter in the U.S. Today, the town of Exeter holds an annual event, Exeter UFO Festival, where they raise money to support local children's charities and commemorate the sighting. Until their deaths, all three men stood by their belief that the objects they saw that night were not known objects. What, then, could they have been? As the letter from the Air Force claims it was still unidentified, we may just have to leave it at that. A UFO visited New Hampshire that early morning in 1965. In recent years, other explanations have been brought forth. For example, perhaps the men saw a KC-97 tanker aircraft, ships that have the same light sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, as the men reported seeing. This was put forth by James McGaugh and Joe Nickel, a retired Air Force major and a skeptic. As the witnesses to this case have since passed, we may not get a satisfactory answer to what exactly was in the sky that night. But the idea that there are still things out there that are yet unknown or explained keep things interesting down here. At least, that's what we at Spooky Stories choose to believe. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. Tune back in next week as we dive into the world of cryptids, extraterrestrials, and the great unknown. Good night.